Welcome to another Mike Reed Reviews. Today we're going to be reading, after a very long hiatus from my last review, American Secession by F.H. Buckley. That would be Frank H. Buckley, not William H. Buckley. No idea if they're related or not. Probably should have done my homework and found out if they were or not. Probably not relevant. So, as I always like to do, first things first, I got this at CPAC 2020. So I have no idea where you might find this exact version of this book, which was published in 2020. So I'll post a link to the closest thing I can get to it, which may actually be this exact version of this book, which is the hardcover version. So I always like to start off these reviews with a discussion of what the book is. And this is going to kind of naturally segue into my actual review of the book. And that's because I'm not sure exactly what this book is. What it is 135 pages, which is nice. But really easy, really like fairly large font. I don't know if you guys can see that. I might have to zoom in on that in editing. It's really hard to tell what this is. It's really hard to tell if there is a thesis to this book. It's really hard to tell if this is just pure op-ed, effectively. It's really hard to tell if this is supposed to be some sort of socio-political study of some sort, with plausibly a hypothesis rather than a true thesis. So my review of this is going to be pretty critical on that ground alone. I can't tell if Frank Buckley is, I'll just call him Frank, is trying to make the case for a specific secession. It's very difficult to tell if he's trying to make the case for a more unilateral pathway towards secession within the states. It's very difficult for me to tell if he's trying to build the case that the states have a right to secede in a more unilateral fashion than kind of exists already. It's very difficult if he's trying to make the case to me that he's trying to convince readers that within their own state, they should be seceding. I have no idea what he's going for with this. And that, I think, is a huge part of why this review is going to be very critical of the book. And here's the thing. When it comes to secession, when it comes to the looming threat of a national breakup, the other way I could interpret this, I suppose, is that he's making a case that it's likely that there will be a secession in the future. I don't think that's really what he's going for more generally. If he's trying to make a certain case, I'm not sure what it is. If he's just generically talking about secession, the book should probably be a little bit more voluminous if it's going to be that case. I think he's trying to make the case that readers should look to secession to resolve certain political issues at a national level. And I am the type that should be very easy to convince of this, and he doesn't convince me. His primary case for why states should be looking towards secession to resolve certain political issues is that America is too big. And it's not clear exactly what he means by big, if he's referring specifically to geography, or if he's referring to population, or if he's referring to the reach of the government. He makes kind of cases for each, but again, in this case, he suffers from what Thomas Sowell talked about in the most recent read we did in Economic Facts and Fallacies. He does a lot of things that are just completely wrong when it comes to the causation versus correlation fallacy. Number one, he does a whole lot of attributing a causal link to, let's say, population and the population and certain negative aspects of a society, right? Certain things that you wouldn't want to have in your country, just by virtue of it being large. Now, there are things that are obviously going to be the case, but there are other things like corruption that aren't necessarily the case. And he's arguing that in the case of something like corruption within a government, that the size of the government necessarily determines the amount of corruption going in. And the worst part is that the data that he produces, and I believe he produces a graph of this on, is it page 60? Oh, no. But he produces raw data, which is good that he's showing the raw data. But the raw data doesn't show a correlation, let alone actual causation. And on top of that, I'm not so sure that he even has the direction of, like Thomas Sowell explains, I'm not so sure he has the direction of causation correct. I think that when you have governments that tend to be very limited in terms of its corruption, it allows those governments to necessarily expand in a much more natural manner, right? When you have a government that is wildly corrupt, you're going to get these military coups that necessarily keep the, let's say, geographical size, the land area of a country, necessarily smaller, right? It's going to be difficult for Rwanda, where you have non-stop military coups because of the wild corruption that's going through there, to, for example, move in on its, let's say that they wanted to move in militaristically on one of the neighboring countries. How do you do that if nobody's getting behind the country itself, let alone the military? How do you do that if you've got to deal with your own military coups that are going on within the country? So, I mean, the other thing is that, like, there are plenty of other big countries that he listed that have a lot of corruption, and then there were plenty of pretty big countries that don't have a lot of corruption in their government. There are plenty of countries that are really small and have a ton of corruption in their government. Rwanda being one of them. Not a whole lot of people, not a whole lot of land, tons of corruption. Guatemala, where we here in the U.S. basically incited the Guatemalan Civil War, which invariably led to the genocide that happened in Guatemala in the middle 90s. By the way, that's why there are so many illegal immigrants in the United States are from Guatemala, not actually Mexico, because specifically of that event, which caused a major migration from Guatemala, an exodus, if you will, from Guatemala to the United States. And again, I'm not making a case for or against immigration in that respect, but he makes a lot of claims that are extremely dubious and then doesn't substantiate them with any sort of credible proof, let alone evidence to support the claim. So the other thing that he shows, he does a lot. The other thing that I wanted to point out is, so in the introduction, which I actually did read, and I suggest that everybody reads, he makes the point that, I think the point I was going for, let's see. So it might happen, secession, it might happen. I see us on a train bound for a breakup. The switches that might stop us have failed, and if we want to remain united, we must learn how to slow the engine. Okay, that's something that seems like a reasonable take, right? But the other take that he offers in the introduction, if I have my notes right here, because it's been a while since I got to the introduction, the originalists in the Supreme Court, would recognize that the framers had thought that the states had the right to secede, while the more politically minded members of the court might hesitate before ruling secession illegal and permitting the president to make war against the state. Instead, the court could be expected to look northward to the more nuanced view of secession rights by the Canadian Supreme Court, which rejected both an absolute right and an absolute bar to secession. He doesn't really provide a legal framework for this. He doesn't really provide a legal framework for where it is that somehow these states are not can have some sort of unilateral right to secede from the binding terms of the contract that is the U.S. Constitution. And I don't think that he quite understands, too, that to secede unilaterally at this point really is an act of war. And this is something that he doesn't bring up. That any state that is looking to secede from the Union right now unilaterally is looking at conducting an act of war. And the federal response to an act of war is war. There's no higher court than the federal courts. So what is there left to do? Well, again, as they've always said, the ultimate decider is violence. So, which is true of government. When you boil down government, the difference between the public sector and the private sector is, when you boil it down to its least common denominator, is that gun. So here's the thing. I think that there should probably be a more direct way through a legislative process, an entirely legislative process, for a state to leave the Union. And I'm not saying you guys should be convinced of that point. What I'm saying is this book should make it easy for me to agree with his takes. And there actually is a legal framework for secession. He brings it up. It would have to come through a convention of the states that is really, really, really difficult. And then at the convention to assemble, and then of course at the convention of the states, they would have to agree to some sort of more direct pathway to secession, and then of course you'd go through that pathway. So I don't know. I kind of really didn't like the book. there wasn't a whole lot of citations. The citations he listed didn't really actually seem to support the claims he was making. If you actually follow the citations, the statistics he cite doesn't really seem to support his conclusions. Like with happiness too, he doesn't understand self-reporting bias, right? That of course places like North Korea are going to report North Korea, which is in terms of population fairly small, in terms of land area tiny. Yeah, if you look at happiness, self-reported happiness in North and South Korea, where you have virtually identical ethnicity, if not some to a major degree cultures, South Koreans are going to show that they are probably less all-around happy. And there's been some anecdotal cases of people who have escaped North Korea. This is one of the major things they talk about as being a huge difference between North Koreans and South Koreans, is that when North Koreans flee North Korea and make it to South Korea by way of China usually, one of the things that they report is that they see the North Koreans as less happy, or South Koreans as less happy than they were. But of course, North Koreans are going to report that they're more happy in that tiny country than they are in the United States, because they don't have the freedom to do so. They don't have the freedom to say, it sucks here, right? They don't know anything other than that sucky life that they live because they've been forcibly secluded from the entirety of the outside world. So they know nothing more. And can you blame them? You really can't. This is what life is like under a dictatorship. Again, this should have been a read I actually liked. The fact that I was able pretty much only to get it at CPAC should have been a red flag. The fact that the book's opening is like 2.5 pages of positive reviews before it actually gets into the book should have been a red flag. The fact that the inserts don't really talk, like these inserts here, I don't know what they're actually called. I think it's called the sleeves, the inner sleeves, don't really tell you much about the book itself. Should have been a red flag, probably. So, I like to close these reviews with a numerical value on a scale of 1 to 10. And the lowest rating I've given a book so far was John Maynard Keynes' General Theory, which was, I think I gave that a 3 out of 10. And it's not that bad. It's not that bad. The general overarching theme seems to be grounded in at least some sort of logic and reality, whereas Keynes's General Theory was an attempt to ground his general theory in economics on a just wild misread of finance. So, there's nothing to even base his theory on. At least there might be something to base this theory on if he said, all right, well, I'm going to make a second attempt at conveying the same message, whatever that message was. There might be something to that, right? But with Keynes' General Theory, there was just nothing to the underlying and fundamental foundational principles upon which the book was, the theory was based. And there might be something to this. And it might have just been a failure to properly apply those theories and principles. So I can't possibly give it a 3. But in my eyes, 5 is just a forgettable book. This was actually a bad book. So I'm thinking I'm going to go with a 4 out of 10. So again, I'll link to where you might find this. I actually like the publishing of the book, especially as a hardcover. So I might actually look into, if I have a book from various publishers, I might actually look into whoever this publisher is. Which looks like Encounter Books. Really, really like the actual print of the book, and not a whole lot of typos and such. So I want to just clue people in on what I'm doing next so that people understand, because this is going to be like the 4th or 5th. This is going to be at least the 3rd negative review in a row that I've done. But the next review I'm going to hopefully be doing is on a book by Thomas Sowell, and I won't reveal what it is, but the book is that long, and I'm that far through it. Not this far, not the big one, the small one, that far through it. So as soon as I get that done, I'll have a review out. It's probably going to be positive because I've generally speaking liked Thomas Sowell's work, and at 70 pages in, I'm actually enjoying the read so far, and I'm able to, because of that, blow through like 10, 15 pages a day easily on my free time. So that'll be another one. I also just got another book, and we'll do a reveal on that in a separate video. I believe it's going to be another book that you guys might recognize, and it's going to be from this year. I'll read it on my own first before I get into a live read here. And yeah, that's what's coming ahead, folks. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And we'll see you in the next one. Good night, folks.